It's my great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Lowe-Hunter, who's speaking to us from Denmark. Elizabeth is a daughter of two harbors, Savannah, Georgia, and Copenhagen, Denmark. She centers expressions of subjectivity, belonging, and material realities among racially minoritized people in Western Europe, specifically Denmark. She specializes in articulations of racism in a so-called raceless context through transnational feminist theories, decolonial and African diasporic thought. She examines relations between race, nation, and gender to raise questions around Western constructions of humanness. She is a PhD student in the Department of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at University of California, Berkeley, with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And thank you all for having me here. It's very special. I feel vulnerable. And I'll share with you some very new questions for me. Well, very new, or actually the questions I started with, and then I went in a big circle and now I'm back. And so many of you might totally have the answers to these questions. I'm asking them and I haven't started really reading about them. So it's like very, it comes from my gut and from my intuition. So I will read something for you. And I'll just set my own little timer to see where I am. Okay. What does it mean to be Black, or perhaps a Blackened European? Specifically in Western European countries whose colonial enterprise violently created a huge African diaspora. What are the conditions for becoming Black within raceless European national discourses? These are some of my questions under the umbrella question about the relationship between race, place, and belonging in Denmark. The more specific questions I want to think about today are some that I'm grappling with as I am in Denmark right now for fieldwork, specifically in relation to my interviews and having to narrow down my research population, as well as thinking about the things I want to be in conversations about with them. So, as I said, I've come back to some of my initial questions. However, they're more refined now and more consciously situated after much study in the fields of African American studies, diaspora studies, decolonial studies, and gender, women, and sexuality studies. So I'll just jump right into the best part, and then I'll give you the context after. I need an Afrofeminism that takes me and us into account. I need an Afrofeminism that can theorize questions about Black political consciousness, kinship, and belonging of those Blackened subjects with a white parent. Black American feminist and literary critic Hortense Spillers published an article in 1987 that is considered seminal within the field of African American studies, at least within the feminist and queer branches. The article was titled, "Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe." I'll actually not go into the valuable offering of this article, but I'll stay with a point that the title itself conveys. That is the certainty with which a Black child within a US slave plantation and socioeconomic historical context was a Black woman's child, whether she got to mother it or not. The narratives of Blackness, Black motherhood, and Black matrilinear constructions of kinship seem foundational to African American feminist thought. Black or African motherhood and sisterhood, chosen as well as biological, also seem central and almost taken for granted in Afro-European feminisms that I've studied so far. I read this as constructions of a close relationship between kinship and mothers in all its meanings. And this all makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in what theories of kinship for Afro-Europeans can look like when the Black mother figure is not part of the family constellation, neither biological nor chosen. Among first-generation African-descended Europeans, those who are born and raised in Europe, many are the children of African or African diasporic immigrant fathers and white European mothers. Moreover, an absence or otherwise a loss of the Black father is also a recurring theme. This sets a stage where there is not a Black mother. Actually, there's no parent, no Black parent at all. This is not just a random pattern of divorced parents within a patriarchal system where the mother ends up with the children, but it's also a divorce between the Black child and its connection to its Blackness. In my research, I'm interested in studying how these children perceive of and develop kinship. I especially think about how those who assume Black politics create kinship. This prompts a question about the possibilities of critical Black consciousness at all under these circumstances. To not have a Black parent, nor that parent's family within reach because of immigration, but a white primary parent and the wide family of that parent in a mainly white and white supremacist society, yet one of colorblind racism and political racelessness, as Theo Goldberg calls it. Jane Ifekwunikwe's study on a similar group in England evokes the term orphan consciousness as something often described to African diasporic Europeans with white parents. But she demonstrates how her interviewees create belonging as active subjects in nuanced ways. But how exactly? It's the how I'm interested in the Danish context. I have a sincere curiosity because it seems against all odds. If we consider that the conditions shaping a sense of self are not just similar to the state Fanon describes in Black Skin, White Masks, a kind of internalized white gaze onto oneself. In this case, there's that, and there's the fact that the child's reference for primary social relations are whitened. Ifekwunikwe mentions the whitened gender, for example. I also want to add the dimension of primary attachment altogether is whitened. No matter whether this attachment has been safe or otherwise. How could Afro-European feminist theory of kinship look like if this particular family constellation is taken into consideration as the base of how generations of people come to know themselves in the world? This includes the messiness of several things being true at the same time. That primary human bonding and care takes place in relation to a mother who, under white supremacy, but more importantly, anti-Blackness, is positioned fundamentally differently than her child who is marked with Blackness. And this is only if bonding and care takes place at all, because it's also important to mention that within this group, there's a relatively high representation in the foster care and adoption system, both nationally and transnationally. Additionally, what Ifekwunikwe states for the case of England, there's a disproportionate representation in the criminal as well as the psychiatric carceral institutions. And as a side note, numbers like this about overrepresentation wouldn't be possible in Denmark because there's no racial categories in the census. So it would require a whole study to produce that data. So what's at stake here? I see a potential for critical interrogations of the relationship between racialized heterosexuality and nation building, which M. Jackie Alexander theorizes, and its modes of operation in colonial, neo-colonial, and imperial contexts. Centering the particular positioning of these Afro-descendant Danes offers unique perspectives to challenge the racialized national status quo and its colorblind logics. It also challenges the existing scholars of racialization in Denmark to not solely identify white supremacy and a generalized racism, but to identify and contextualize specific modes of oppression, namely anti-Blackness and also Islamophobia, and their rootedness in Danish coloniality. On a different scale, these stories working towards could be a way to simply break. I'll just start again. On a different scale, talking about these stories could be a way to break the silence and isolation, which characterizes the experiences of this generation of 1980s kids, of Black African immigrant fathers and white mothers. First of all, it can be an ungaslighting situation to hear these stories. But secondly, it could create possibilities for being reflected in other stories, which may lay the ground for kinds of kinship where recognition and humanization can take place. And here I use humanization to evoke a mode of being without the default alienation and exotification of the home. What is at stake is the wellness, loving self-recognition, and a sense of belonging, without which I can't imagine any of the African diasporic movements in Denmark would exist. At the same time, I wonder what is the connection between internalized whiteness and the prevailing discourses of integration and inclusion rather than freedom and abolition? And what is the relationship between Black consciousness and trans queer communities that makes this intersection a context for particular radical organizing and imagination? So here comes the background for what I'm doing. My dissertation research is a project about developing a language to express racial consciousness, African diasporic subjectivity, and belonging in Denmark today. Specifically, I plan to listen to oral stories of first-generation African-descended Danish people from the 1980s, more or less. I focus on this generation because there were very few others when this generation grew up, and we got used to navigating being the only one in a sea of white. This generation also grew up and came into early adulthood without the internet and all of its images as a possible reflection available right in our pocket. Far from that. We grew up at the mercy of television and radio and occasional movies. And importantly, I focus on the kids of the African diasporas who had to navigate all of this whiteness and absence of representation in society at large, in cultural representation, and also in the home. To from an Afrofeminist Danish perspective, I've been studying and reading towards a way to carve out space between larger discourses of race, racism, and racialization in the Western European context and in the US. While Europeans and Europeanness is imagined as white, concepts of Blackness are dominated by Black Americanness. My group is neither. Now, in the local context, two interconnected discourses are at work. Danish means white, and brown of any kind means foreigner. Again, my group is neither. Therefore, a lot of my previous reading and writing has been focused on examining and understanding exactly how the racializing dynamics function in Denmark and how to articulate it in Danish. Importantly, figuring out how to do this within a culture of Nordic exceptionalism, which conveniently forgets its colonial past and present and makes claims to an innocent, race-free current society. The Black child, while a white mom family constellation, can be a nexus for rich analysis of the gendered and racialized reproductive needs of nation building, which are compromised here. These white mothers do not reproduce the nation because they do not produce proper citizens. It again highlights the importance of attention to specific racial categorizations and what so-called intermixing with white leads to, where violent intermixing or rape is a tool of genocide and settler colonialism in certain contexts. In relation to Blackness, it's the reverse effect. It reproduces the dominated, not the dominant. Understanding the political, economic, and historical reasons for this is crucial to understanding modes of racialization today. From the vantage point of these children, there's an excellent view to the ways that nationhood, statehood, racialization, and heterosexuality are meant to match up in particular ways. But in fact, there are gaps, overlaps, and entanglements in ways that blur the lines of the relations of power in the current status quo. What is the potential of, for example, mobilizing radical Black politics while betraying our relative civic privileges rather than assimilating? After all, as Huriya Butelja has stressed, we are marginalized, but at the margin of the center. This family constellation can also have the potential to explore the ways Black kinship in the West has always relied on queer kinship. The basis of the Black person in the West is violent rupture from both land and kin, and the ruptures continue. And this is part of what Hortense Spillers theorizes so well. So without using either queerness or Blackness as metaphors, how can we think about the ways that these Afro-diasporic children live in a state of alienation as default, regardless of whether they assume a Black political consciousness or live in sexually queer relationships? Poet and scholar Alan Pelaez Lopez once said on a podcast called Bitter Brown Femmes, and I paraphrase a little loosely, that there's no coming out moment when you've never had a place to come out from as a Black person. I need an Afrofeminism that theorizes from this inherent alienation in the intimate sphere that makes sense of the particular possibilities and impossibilities of kinship, and a feminism that explores the healing potential of experiencing belonging and its centrality for developing a critical political consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, thank you for that really thoughtful talk. Thank you so much.